Thank you very much, Lal, for coming here. Emerson's one of the great companies of this world. I'm wondering if you can just think back a little bit to when you were an MBA student. How did you chart your success as you think back? How did that journey work to get from a young man, a young boy in Portugal not speaking English to sitting here as a CEO of a world-class global organization? How did that work? Did you know it when you were sitting in Portugal at 10 years old?
God, no. Thank you for having me, Scott. Great to be here. No, I didn't even know it when I joined Emerson in 1995. By no means was it my objective at that time to become Chief Executive Officer of the company. Very honestly, I was happy to have a job at that point in a company where I thought I could make a difference. It was an interesting point in time. It was a business that was predominantly an American business and didn't have a lot of people that had my experiences as a global citizen. And it was a company that was expanding globally and had that desire. And so I felt that my skill set could be differentiated there. And hence I joined the company. But I never really thought about my career, very honestly, beyond more than 5-year periods. I thought about skills. I had short-term goals more than long-term goals. And very honestly, when David Farr, my predecessor, first approached me on the succession process, I told him, no thanks. No thanks. I had, at that point, moved 8 times with my family, crossed the ocean, as Logan described, a number of times, little children, back and forth, met my wife in Paris, and asked her to move a bunch of times with me. And I was very happy. I had accomplished professionally more than a 10-year-old boy who grew up in a multiracial environment in Lisbon could ever dream of. I was not motivated by the power of the job, by the financial elements of the job. I was motivated by life and the balance of life and family and what I thought was a set of goals that I had by far already accomplished. So I said no to the man on the phone. He told me that I could potentially learn a little bit more about myself if I went through the testing processes that Emerson was putting the candidates through, that I could learn perhaps something about myself, that I could be a better leader having gone through those processes, and who can argue against that? And so I said, sure. I said, I'll go through the testing and maybe I will learn something. And so I did that, Scott, through the summer of 2016, just to give you an idea how long this went. And it culminated with a meeting. I'll just tell the story quickly, Scott. It culminated with a meeting in the fall of 2017 in the office of David Farr, my predecessor. And the objective of the meeting was to kind of relay the results of the test and talk about next steps, et cetera, et cetera. So I sat down. I had 3 weeks to go or so before my meeting, and I started writing. And I ended up writing a 30-page PowerPoint. And that 30-page PowerPoint had everything that I thought worked well at Emerson and everything that I think the next CEO should change. And it created a vision for that company. And I packed it up, printed 2 copies, went down to St. Louis. That Saturday morning, he never met people in his office, my predecessor. We met in a conference room, handed over the 30 pages, and nearly 4 hours later, he said to me, I can't support most of what you've written. A lot of it is a criticism of my time as a CEO, my leadership. But he said, but Lal, you're the only person in 6 that has come here and put a vision and a thought together. And how can you sit here and tell me you don't want to be CEO of this company? And that was my story. I went back to the Twin Cities. I talked to my wife, and I took those 30 pages. I created one typed Word document with the vision, acceleration of value creation built on culture, portfolio, and execution. And I went on to visit with the directors in what was a prolonged succession process, of course. In December of 2020, a month before, essentially almost a month, a little over a month before I became CEO, I had dinner with the director in St. Louis. He reached deep into his blue blazer, pulled out a piece of paper, unfolded it. It was the piece of paper I had given him back in 2017. And he pointed at it and he said, "Lal, do you still believe in this?" And I said, "Yes, I do, Jim." Jim Turley, who's now our chair. He folded it back up, put it in his pocket, and said, "We're done here." And 5 weeks later, I was CEO of the company. And that was the story. So not as a little boy, but everything that happened in my life culminated in standing out, believing in a different vision, and standing by those beliefs.
Wow. A lot of serendipity in there. I'm sure you didn't know that as a 10-year-old in Portugal. I'm curious, being a CEO is, of course, very demanding existence. And a lot of students wonder, can I have a life while being a CEO, or can I while being a senior executive? How do I balance the multiple demands on my life? You have children, you're married, you want to have a private life. You just ran the New York Marathon 2 days ago.
Yesterday,
sorry. So he ran. So if he's limping like a little bit, he has a good excuse because he just ran the New York Marathon as a qualified participant.
I usually walk a lot faster than I just showed.
So how do you manage balance? What have you learned about the whole balance equation throughout your life?
It's a phenomenal question, Scott, and an important one. I firmly believe that it's important to be honest with oneself about your goals. And your goals should encompass your career, your family, and yourself. My family, for me, is all that's worth living for. Without them, having any job is not worthwhile. My health, because without my health, I can't be with my family, I can't do the job that I do, is very important. I chose running. I was a runner when I was a young kid, and I fell back in love with it in the 30s. I choose that as a way to be mentally clear, to have time to think, to have perspective, and to have the energy to do the job and to be with my family. The work itself has to be something that you are truly passionate about. It sucks, I'm certain it would, to get up in the morning and go do something that you don't like doing. And none of us should ever be dishonest enough with ourselves that we do that. The place we go to work is a place where we end up spending the bulk of our time. But what matters, and what ultimately matters, is our family and our lives as part of our lives. To me, that's how I think about it. When I'm gone one day, and my father just passed 3 weeks ago and made me think about a lot of these things. When I'm gone one day, it's not going to say he was CEO of Emerson on my tombstone or wherever I am. It's going to say he was a father, he was a husband, he was a grandfather. That's what matters.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Having spent a lot of time abroad myself and speaking another language at home like you have, being global in business is really important. And about 40% of our students at Darden identify themselves as global. And I'm wondering, and I know you guys recruit anyone from around the world for your company. I'm just wondering what advice you would have for global students that are coming to the United States and considering a career at your company or others, and conversely, Americans that may have never worked abroad and then they go to another environment. What can you share with us about what you learn about being global?
Well, it's an important aspect of how business works, and it's not necessarily the tactical elements of business, but it's really the human elements of what we do every day. I was the beneficiary of living a bit of an expat life with my father, and in his career. First 10 years of my life in Portugal, we lived in a couple of countries that shortly after we lived there were no longer countries. We lived in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, when Tito was still alive, and then we lived in Kinshasa, Zaire, where I went to high school, and that gave me, from a very young age, perspective of thought, diversity of thought, opinion, a global approach to problem solving. I think that's really, really important. We, as I became CEO, began to sponsor foreign students because I did not believe that we were doing the company, the shareholders, a service by ignoring a whole set of talent that's out there. Obviously, being an immigrant myself, I felt a strong personal connection to that. But what that brings to the table for us is experience, it's perspective, it's thought. And the same goes for American students. The opportunity to see the world, to experience the world, to understand how people in China, how people in Europe, how people in the Middle East think is very, very important. It's part of what will make us a better global company, a better global set of citizens, and more engaged in what happens around the world.
Yeah. So in a 27-year career at Emerson, you've seen a lot of different things happening. I'm curious if you could share some highlights of how you see the world through the lens of your corporation. Today we were talking a little bit about, at lunch, about Russia, China, other things that you're seeing, even our own country here, with elections coming up this week. Yeah. I'm just curious, like, what is it that you see through the lens of being a global CEO right now?
Well, the first thing I'll say, and you mentioned our own country, one of the signs that I saw at the New York City Marathon, somewhere in Brooklyn, and a lot of it yesterday because of the weather was hazy, was run to the polls. That's a responsibility that we all have as citizens of this country and the best way to make our voice heard. So I hope you all either have voted or will vote tomorrow. But having said that, we are living in uncharted waters. The role of a public company CEO has changed tremendously over the last 5-6 years. Maybe that's a result of so many tech founding CEOs where they felt the ability, because of their own positions in the company, stock positions in the company, to have a social voice. But every CEO of every company, including myself, has an expectation from its employees to have that social voice. And I'm okay. I'm comfortable with that. We came out in support of women in the Dobbs decision. That's a decision that we made as a management team that we felt was important from a lens of inclusivity. From a lens not to exclude others, but to include as many as we can as we think about talent and as we think about opportunities. But there are many things that can keep a CEO up at night. Europe, we talked about at lunch, an energy crisis underway, still in the early innings there, I would suggest, but something that is very challenging and will create a big challenge as we go through the winter into the spring. I see it from two perspectives: demand, in industrial demand in Europe, and energy costs in our 20 manufacturing plants in Europe that are up as high as 60% versus last year. And that's not for heating of facilities, but for essential manufacturing processes like coatings and painting, etc. The other element is China. We have a phenomenal business in China, over 8,000 employees, 20 manufacturing facilities all over China, engineering centers. In this $2 billion business, 96% of what we sell in China is made in China. We've been there since 1974. So obviously, the nationalistic geopolitical tensions there are very concerning. We've continued to make investments in China as we've gone through this tough period of time, building a new plant in Shanghai, a new engineering center. But I'm concerned about that. And hence, I took a seat on the board of the U.S.-China Business Council to ensure that my voice, the voice of our company, and the importance of a balanced economic agenda is heard in Washington, D.C. around China. And then, of course, you mentioned it, our own country and the various social dimensions and political stresses that we have that have been more divisive than ever here, and how we tread those waters very carefully as leaders is very important.
Yes. As you think about some of those divisive issues and even the global issues that emerge and what is divisive in one country is not divisive in another and so on, I'm just curious, how do you choose when to weigh in or when not to weigh in on a given topic? Because the pressures on you to weigh in on every situation in the world practically must be inexhaustible.
You are right. I could write a memo almost every week. And so we created a team of leaders in the company, not inclusive of myself, who review issues and bring them to me with recommendations. We found that that's a good balanced way to decide whether we should have a voice or not. I do believe that in many cases, Dobbs was one of them, but not the only one, where saying nothing says a lot. I do believe that. And so we will be courageous. We will be as inclusive as we can be, and as modern as we can be. But we also recognize that saying something also alienates a lot of folks, and the balance of how we say it does matter as a company.
Yeah. So when you take over as a CEO, so you described your journey and the vision that you laid out on the PowerPoint. I'm just curious, when you actually took the reins of power, what do you do in your first 100 days, as the famous 100 days, or is the 100 days mythical and it doesn't really matter? And what do you do when you take over as the CEO? What happens?
So I had this benefit, Scott, of being the insider activist. My agenda was based on one very basic premise: accelerating value creation. If you looked at the 12 years since the financial crisis to when I became CEO, our value creation proposition lagged the S&P 500, our industrial peers, and any industrial index that you can look up. It was bottom. We went from being a company with a multiple at the top decile of our peer group to being at the bottom quartile of our peer group. That happens in slow motion. When you look at it through that lens of a decade, it was there. So clearly, working harder or doing more of the same thing wasn't going to change that. And so the agenda and the thesis that I wrote and shared with the board was turning the company upside down. It started with culture. I felt that as a CEO, the biggest single battle, war, whatever you want to call it, that I would have to fight as a CEO is the war on talent. How do I retain, how do we attract the best to come work in our company? And for that, the culture had to be modernized. I spoke of us having a culture that was more 1950s than 2020, and that's entirely true. It was an autocratic, controlling place to work. And the way to survive it, as I did, and Nick Piazza, who's here with me, have done over the years, was by creating microclimates around where you worked, the businesses you ran, the functions that you were responsible for, and insulating those individuals in those teams as best you could. But knowing very well that ultimately the corner office of the corporation matters, as it sets tone and culture throughout the entire enterprise. So there's a lot to unpack in the whole culture pillar that we developed. Modernization, work from home policies. We have a policy, standing policy, 3 days work from home for all our employees around the world. We've modernized our employee value proposition, our recruiting, our talent engine that Nick's responsible for, our MBA recruiting, elements around benefits, vacation, all modernized to be competitive in an era where we're competing for you and many like you globally. That was the first pillar. The second pillar was the portfolio, and one I'm sure we'll talk about where we've been also equally very active. And the portfolio really built around starting from a position of strength, 3 great franchises, top performing in amongst their peers, but not cohesive. in nature, and not with elements of lacking growth. And we needed to address the portfolio to really create and unlock value. And we've done some important things to do that. And the last is the execution piece. Can't just think strategy, you got to think how do you do things. And the management, how we run the company, the Emerson management process, and many articles written about this in the 80s and 90s, was designed in 1973. McKinsey and Company came in, worked with Chuck Knight, who was CEO from 73 to 2000, designed the management process. The title of the management process is Planning is About Control. Well, when your management process is planning is about control, guess what you get? You get a business that is very risk averse, that doesn't drive a whole lot of innovation, that drives great profitability, and doesn't miss very widely. And so those three pillars, we got to work very, very quickly. Setting up the team, hiring a new chief people officer from the outside, naming a new sustainability officer in the company, elements of modernizing the management team, and putting people in the right jobs was very important. So we exited some folks, which I needed to do within 2 weeks of becoming CEO, put the team in place, and started running around that vision.
It's very clear that you've put talent front and foremost because you're here on MBA campuses recruiting. That for me is always the sign that people matter when you actually show up at the front line. So thank you for doing that. You were describing a little bit your leadership development program, which sounded really exciting to me, but also a number of geographies that you guys are in. And I know that students are, often thinking about, well, where could I live? What types of geographies are possible? So describe a little bit some of the cities that you guys operate in the United States and exciting environments outside the United States.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to, Scott. And we just revamped our MBA program. I was an MBA recruit when I joined Emerson in 1995. I was part of a class of about 30 MBAs from about as many business schools around the country and some European business schools as well that joined the corporation. But the program over time became, in lack of a better word, undifferentiated. It became undifferentiated from a competitive perspective and from an incoming candidate perspective. So we redesigned that with Nick's leadership, who's here with me today. We now will have a rotational program, a 4-year program, which includes an international placement, and that's optional. Again, because we do know that family situations, dual incomes, different elements may preclude students from wanting to do that. But we'll have that available as part of it, and it includes a placement process into a business, into a function, into an area, following the rotations that the prospective candidate and us feel is a better fit. So it's much more structured design, but really to give a broad experience at the beginning of the career versus what we had traditionally, which was come on in, you get into a job, and then you kind of sink or swim your way through the company, and which is very much the way I grew up and as I came into the program. We operate globally, but approximately in the new Emerson, which we just got smaller to get more valuable with the transaction last week, slightly under 45% of that revenue is in the United States. So it's a global company with about 40,000 employees outside the United States, 20,000 in the United States. We operate all over Europe. Our primary countries in Europe are Germany, a very large base, and Italy equally, but we have operations all over Eastern Europe as well as Western Europe. In Asia, our largest market is China, with, as I mentioned, about 8,000 employees. Very large, the largest automation player in China, but we run the business in Asia out of Singapore, and we have a large base in India as well, with manufacturing and engineering and sales leadership. And then in the United States, our large cities are Austin, Texas, Boston, Massachusetts, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Houston, of course, we have a large base there, and Boulder, Colorado. Those would be the largest places where we we have employees. Of course, our corporate headquarters today is in St. Louis, Missouri, where the company was founded in 1890. But if you read last week's release, we're also going through a process of potentially, we're going through a process of choosing a headquarters location going forward, inclusive of St. Louis, of course.
Yeah. Sounds very attractive combined with the work remotely, a flexible policy. I'm curious, tell us a little bit about the deal that you just did with Blackstone. I'm wondering what it's like to do an M&A deal with the king of Wall Street, Steve Schwarzman. And what's it like as a CEO going through that process? You know, how much of your time does it take? What do you have to do, or do you just, put it all on the investment bankers and say, go do it?
No, thanks for the question. And it's all encompassing for a CEO. This was actually a deal that management drove right up to the LOI. And bankers didn't come in until afterwards. Of course, Blackstone does not utilize bankers per se, but we did with our partners at Centerview Bank and Centerview Partners and Goldman Sachs. But here's kind of the if I step back a few months prior to the LOI, and our LOI was signed in May of this year with Blackstone. It took us to, of course, last Sunday to sign, but that's just the length of the negotiations and the state of the capital markets. So if you go back to about a year ago, I stopped sleeping at night. And the reason I stopped sleeping at night was that we were printing incredible results as a company. From the depths of the pandemic to where we were, if you looked at underlying sales growth, underlying EPS growth, there were highly differentiated results versus any industrial peer in the marketplace. However, we were not seeing those results translated into the performance of the stock. And I knew that the team couldn't work any harder. The results couldn't get any better. We were generating operating leverage of 60% at that point in time. I mean, just off the charts, operating leverage. And so I stopped sleeping at night. And what it came down to was that the makeup of the portfolio was not allowing us to unlock value in the company. What happens in portfolios is typically, and of course we're nearing the end, I should say, of the age of the diversified industrial. There are a few left. Honeywell's left. There's a few left. But the UTCs are gone. The GEs are about to go. We're very much gone now as a diversified industrial. What Wall Street values, investors value, is growth and focus, cohesiveness. And what happens to a company in a diversified state when you're not valued for the addition of the sum, so where 1 + 1 = 3, but 1 + 1 becomes 1.5, that's what was happening essentially to us. We started being valued to the lowest common denominator. The trading multiple of our climate business was the lowest common denominator. And that's what's happened. So we went through a body of work with our board starting in October of last year to define and to understand whether this is truly the case. We had great partners who came in and helped us. Bain & Company helped us. Of course, Goldman Sachs and Centerview helped us from the banking side. And we defined a path, a vision, and a pathway around the portfolio to create the world's most diverse automation company. And thematically investing along a technology stack of intelligent devices, control, and software, and serving a variety of different industries. Process industries, hybrid, which is things like life sciences, metals and mining, industries in that realm, and then discrete manufacturing, packaging, automotive, semiconductor, et cetera. But all consistent on the technology stack that I described. And then we got to work. The AspenTech transaction was an important one, and that sent a signal to the street that we were going to be creative in our transactions. We didn't necessarily, and I don't believe, we necessarily need to own 100% of something for it to work for our shareholders. We own 55% of AspenTech, It's a publicly traded company. A very interesting governance model in the way we constructed it, but it's working as an avenue to build our software business in a software company. And that's the business that's based in Boston. And then the next step was begin to sell parts of the business that just were not good businesses. They're good businesses, but not cohesive to the automation story. InSinkErator, phenomenal company. It's the world's leading garbage disposer business. 8-to-1 relative market position. So highly profitable. By all measures, a good business, but not cohesive to the automation theme. We sold and closed that business last Monday to Whirlpool. Whirlpool Corporation bought the business, paid an 18 times multiple for the business. Phenomenal transaction for our shareholders. And then the climate tech business. Because of its sheer size and value, it's a $5 billion business, 21% EBITDA. There are very few private equity firms and no strategic buyers for the business. It's a business that manufactures compressors for HVACR applications. Large customer base in people like Carrier, Trane, Lennox, companies in China, companies in Europe. So, but no strategics. And so we were left with two options. Private equity, of which the world of the big ones, particularly in a challenge environment, is very small. It's 2 or 3, 4. And, or spin. Or we could spin the company ourselves. So we went through that analysis with our board. I began having dinners and creating relationships with the CEOs of the big private equity companies. Created a very close relationship with the leadership team at Blackstone, specifically John Gray and Joe Barata. And we moved very quickly with a proposal that they put in front of us. In what turned out to be an environment that got progressively more difficult from a transaction perspective, not just what was going on in the debt markets, the fact that bank balance sheets became more and more challenged through the summer and through the early fall, but also the prospect of a consumer recession gave a lot of concern whether we ultimately get to signing. But it was a great, I thought, a great body of work for both firms, two great firms to pull this off, and now we have a great partnership as we go forward.
Well, congratulations on the transaction.
Thanks.
I know it must be all-consuming. This week we have U.S. presidential election, not presidential, congressional elections, and there's talk that trust in institutions may be approaching some kind of an all-time low. I don't know how we know that in the history of the world, but anyway, it's taken a dip. And I'm just curious, a lot of people look to business maybe as part of the solution. How do you view the role of business in society in doing the right thing and solving some of the challenges we as a society face?
Yeah. It's I'll answer it from two perspectives. The first, Scott, is I think it's important for business, any business, ours inclusive of ours, to have purpose and meaning. The things that we do will make our planet better. How do you capture carbon? How do you make power generation less harmful? How do you support the advent of wind power? We talked about wind power and we're standing there with Logan. How do you support investments in the different technologies, the new emerging energy technologies such as hydrogen as a company? That's a role that we are incredibly well positioned and give purpose to what we do on a daily basis. My daughter at Thanksgiving dinner, I have 7-year-old twins, when we went around the table last Thanksgiving and asked what we were thankful for, and each of us said something. My son said that he was thankful for mommy and daddy. My daughter said she was thankful that people don't throw plastic bottles in the ocean. So a 7-year-old girl has a perspective of the environment and of the planet, as I do, and as we do as a company. So that's incredibly important. Our customers, many of which include the large energy players, 22% of our sales go into the energy markets. Our customers are walking and chewing at the same time. They're trying to figure out how to make energy more affordable and secure, particularly after what we've seen in Europe in the war in Ukraine and the impacts of that, but also how to make the world more sustainable and what they do more sustainable. And our technology has an incredible role in doing that. So that's number one, purpose. Purpose is important. Secondly, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Look, I'm not shy of making my opinions heard, but I'm also very measured. I sit on the board of the Federal Reserve in the 8th District with Jim Bullard. That precludes me from participating in political activities, which is a bit of a good thing. But I feel that there's a responsibility that I have to our employees as they reach out on specific issues. And we talked about Dobbs. I've written about Asian American violence, black rights, various subjects that are important to the company that we are trying to create here. And that's a responsibility that I think I have, and it weighs on me very heavily.
You mentioned your role in the Federal Reserve, and of course, as a global business, you must have some perspective on how the world economy is doing. I know students often wonder, what are the prospects looking like as we look forward the next 6 to 18 months? Do you see a recession? What do you see?
Yeah, no, it's a bit bifurcated, Scott, as we spoke earlier. I think clearly on the consumer side, things have slowed. I think the data clearly supports that. However, I'm not going to say that we're immune, that we're immune as an industrial company. However, from the macros, however, the energy equation is one that is at least providing a bit of an element of continued strength in business. We are in the midst of a huge global investment in natural gas. The world lost one of its largest suppliers of natural gas in Russia. All of a sudden, investments in Qatar, in Texas, in Louisiana have grown and are being funded exponentially. Just in Texas alone, we are in the midst of an investment of 10 liquefied natural gas investments. So a lot of activity there. Now, whether that provides immunity to the broader economic cycle, I don't know. We did not plan a recession in 2023 in our business. The underlying, and we guided last week, if you saw that, we guided annually a midpoint of 7.5% underlying growth for 2023. We come into the year with a tremendous amount of a very strong backlog position, $5 billion. We have underlying growth rates of mid to high single digits right now, which we expect to continue as we go through the year. And it's being bolstered by significant investments in energy and in sustainability. So it's tough to read. I do believe, sitting on the Fed Reserve, that they're going to be aggressive, and that they're very concerned about where inflation sits. And the data continues to show, at least to date, that it's not hurting job creation as rates go up, and it's not slowing down the economy. So you can imagine great debates in that boardroom. And Jim Bullard, I don't know if you've met him, Scott, but he's quite a hawk when it comes to interest rates, and that's the position he's taken momentarily. So I'm enjoying that experience very much.
Well, congratulations on your life journey, on your phenomenal success at Emerson, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us here at Darden today.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott.